Good afternoon. Welcome to our new webinar series on forms and workflows with Microsoft 365. My name is Peter Carson. I'll get into intros in a second, and going to start with the first of the three-part series here today on building employee self-service forms with Microsoft 365. So here, let me flip ahead in my deck. I mentioned my name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager, also in Office Apps and Services, Microsoft MVP. Contact info is here. We're going to publish a copy of the deck as well as a recording up on the same event page that you came to register. So if you want to grab any of those details, they'll all be available there. A little background if you're not familiar with Extranet User Manager. We're an ISV. We're part of Envision IT, which is the consulting side of the business, and really focus on building external digital communities. But today's topic is really going to be internal focusing. How do you build forms and workflows for your staff? But actually those learnings can be applied to externals and other scenarios as well as part of that. That's just a good business scenario to use from a context point of view. So let's skip through the backgrounds and get right to the agenda of what we're going to cover off. Today's session is I always run the risk of getting too technical, but I'm going to try and keep it fairly non-technical and more business focused. And then I'm going to save the technical side for sessions 2 and 3. We're going to get it deeper into two of the scenarios, the leave request form and the expense form that we're going to be talking about at a high level here today. Actually, before I forget, let me turn my camera off just so you've got a bigger view of the screen. There we go. You don't need to see the junk behind me in there. So yeah, we're going to talk more about those two scenarios. We're also going to talk about broader technology choices, how we manage the collecting of employee information from a security and privacy point of view, and how we leverage Power BI from a management dashboard perspective, which is really useful in a lot of these scenarios as well. We do have the Q&A open, so if you have questions as we're going through, feel free to raise them there. I've got the team on the line as well. They'll be answering questions as we go through, and then if there's ones that we need to actually speak to, we can either take a pause or hold those to the end of the session from there. I do want to start with a quick poll, just get a sense of how people are using the tools that we're going to be talking about here today. It's a very simple one. It's really one main question that talks about the different technologies. Even if you're not sure what they are, don't worry, you can answer a not sure what this is up to actively using. What I find works well, we've put a QR code in there. Normally I don't like QR codes, but in this case it actually works well. So I've got my phone on the other screen here. What you can do is just go to your camera app. I'm literally screening my my desktop screen here and say open in Chrome. So you don't actually take a picture of it, you just get the camera app open so you can launch up the form. And this is actually a good example of a Microsoft form and how it adapts well from a mobile point of view. So we do ask for name and email, and then really it gets into the main question. It's done a nice job of laying it out from a mobile point of view. You see the chevrons on the right-hand side there. I can expand each of those sections, answer appropriately through there. If you don't want us to bug you, by all means, hit the not right now from a follow-up point of view and go ahead and submit that. We'll come back a little later just to have a look at results from that point of view. So I'll let you do that on your second screen, hopefully, and follow along from here. Now, for those of you who weren't aware, it doesn't feel like as big a bang in the virtual world, but Ignite happened last week, so March 2021, there's some highlights in there, particularly around the Power Platform side of things, which is an area that we're going to be focusing on in here. Ignite's now gone from a once a year fall event to a twice a year spring and fall. So this is sort of their 6-month update. There's a link down at the bottom here. When you've got the deck, you'll be able to use that to go to the Ignite 2021 book of news. That's published by Microsoft. It's a very exhaustive, long list of all the cool features they've announced across their entire product stack. But some of the things that are relevant to today's conversations is this launch of PowerFX, which is a low-code programming language. It's really targeted to people that are familiar with Excel and Excel formulas. I know that's not everybody, but there are a lot of Power users out there that do some amazing things with Excel. And sometimes that gets scary because you end up with hundreds of spreadsheets cross-linked with each other, and it can become a pretty frightening scenario from an application point of view. But using PowerApps to tap into that knowledge of how you program things from an Excel point of view and actually build out your PowerApps from there. We're not actually going to go too deep in PowerApps. I'm going to cover it as a technology choice, but it's not one of the examples we're going to get into from a scenario point of view, and I'll explain why as we get deeper into that. There's some security and governance for IT pros, a new Power Platform Admin Center, which is sort of an all-up place to go, not just for PowerApps, but Power Automate, which we will be talking a fair bit about, and some improvements around data loss protection. So ensuring that, privacy data, personal information, personal health information, things like that can get flagged from DLP point of view, and appropriate governance put around that. And then the last thing, maybe this is a future topic we should cover, is the Power Virtual Agents. It's this idea of not even having a form, but having a bot. So imagine you're in Teams and you open the employee self-service channel or team and just ask a question of the bot saying, hey, I'd like to book a day off next week. And it can go through a series of questions and answers more interactively from a conversational point of view and actually build that request and submit it for approval for you. So it's kind of an interesting way of doing forms or employee self-service. It's not something that we're going to cover here, but it is something I'm thinking about from a future point of view. So what are some of the examples from a employee self-service point of view? The list is pretty long. There's lots of different things that you can do. A lot of these examples we've done for different clients over the years. The whole onboarding, job change, offboard. You've got a new person and a bunch of things that happen, or somebody changed role and things need to change there, or somebody's leaving the organization. How do we offboard them effectively? Make sure all the tasks get done and things from that point of view. That's an obvious one. Any sort of employee personal data, things like banking information for payroll, T4 slips, things like that. Expense reports, leave requests that we're going to look at here today. Benefits and pension calculators we've done for clients. Tax slips, training, performance management, the list goes on, and this is not a complete list. There's lots that can be done from this point of view. We're a pretty small organization. We're only 18 people, so we don't have a lot of forms and processes, but when we look at a lot of our larger clients, as we get into the hundreds or thousands of staff within an organization, quite often there's literally hundreds of different forms that may span the spectrum from fillable PDFs to just print them out and fill them in by hand PDFs to Word documents to Excels. It's kind of all over the map. And it's not a trivial task to take these and say, okay, we want to fully automate this, because it's not just about creating the form, it's about creating the workflow and process that sits behind that. Now, it doesn't need to be fully automated. Taking an example of the first one, onboarding. You might have a form that says, okay, somebody new is starting and here's their job role and their manager, and this is what they need. They're a knowledge worker, so they need a laptop and a desk and a phone and a bunch of things set up and access to a bunch of systems that your organization uses. That could be as simple as sending out tasks to different parts of your team saying, hey, make sure that facilities knows they need a desk assigned to them, and make sure that IT is set up a laptop for them and an account and an email address and all those sorts of things. And it could be them just checking those off and saying, hey, is everything done? It doesn't have to be a fully automated process. There's a lot of value in just sort of capturing what needs to be done and then tracking it from a task management point of view. But as we get into things like expense reports, leave requests, those we often see a lot of automation around that. We're going to use our own company examples, but I have another form that I'm going to share for one that we're doing for a client that has deep SAP integration and cost centers and project codes and things like that need to get tracked and managed through that process, so they can get quite sophisticated from an application integration point of view. So the first scenario we're going to get into is the Envision IT leave request form. Very simple form. There's only 5 fields on it. What type of request are you making? What's the start and end dates for it? What are the total business days? And we debated this one. Should we have the form be smart and figure out, oh, I'm choosing from this date to this date, and there happens to be a stat holiday in the middle of that, and what should the days be? We said, you know what, we're going to keep it real simple. Just let the employee figure it out. If they do it wrong, and it sometimes gets confusing when it spans statutory holidays, people aren't sure what to put in there. The approver can manage that and double check it and make sure it's correct from that point of view. And then just a free form comments field. Now we've decided to use Microsoft Forms for this. The advantage there is it's super easy to build a form like this. The caveat is that it's not the type of form that you can fill out, save as a draft, come back and finish later, submit it, change it. It's very much fill it in and done, away you go from there. So from a consideration point of view, what we looked at here, we wanted to track things like vacation days allocated, accrued, already taken, but we weren't going to put that on the form. We're going to have that on a dashboard separately, and I'll show you how that works. But regardless of what technology we use to build this, security is really important. I mean, this is private information, particularly when we get into sick days, personal days, things like that, comments that are in there. This is super private from that point of view. So we want to make sure that staff can see their own requests, managers can see their direct and indirect reports, but others can't see it from there. We don't want to just hide things. We do want to actually properly secure things. And how do we deal with changes before or after approval? Just cancel it and submit a new one. It's only 5 questions. It's not a big deal to resubmit it from that point of view. And reconciliation is always important. We have a time tracking system where a big part of our organization is a consulting company, so time is everything. Making sure that it's tracked appropriately, so we can actually reconcile what gets tracked from a vacation point of view in the time tracking against what was requested. Make sure that all jives up from that point of view. So I mentioned Microsoft Forms. This is the Forms tool, and I'll show you how we build the form out, as well as what the end user experience looks like. That it's very easy for building intake forms, surveys, and super straightforward to use and build. It does integrate nicely with SharePoint and PowerAutomate, so we can build a flow workflow that I'll talk about in a second. And forms can be anonymous, like the one that I shared out at the beginning of this session, where you don't need to be signed in, you just fill it out. I mean, we asked for contact information as part of that, but it didn't require you to authenticate as part of that. You can literally type in whatever you want in those fields. Or you can say, this is just for authenticated people, and we want the form to know who's filling it out. It's no longer anonymous. And that's the example that we want to use here in the leave request. We want people signed into Azure Active Directory, properly authenticated. We know the right people are submitting those forms in. And the second half of that is the PowerAutomate side, to say, hey, once somebody submits that form, there's things that need to happen. So how does that workflow work? Well, it needs to send an email to your manager and maybe to their manager as a backup to let them know, hey, a request has been made and you need to approve it. How does that approval work? Flow takes care of all that for us. And Flow is a really rich ecosystem. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of connectors available with Flow. Some of them are standard, some of them are premium. We'll talk about the licensing implications of those a little bit later. But it's super easy to visually draw out the flow, and I'll show you what that looks like in a sec as well. So what does the architecture look like? Well, we've got our Microsoft form that I'll show you that you fill out to submit your request, and when that submits, that triggers a PowerAutomate workflow. That workflow is going to look up in Azure Active Directory to get your manager information to say, hey, who do I need to send this to from an approval point of view? And it's going to send out an approval email. And actually, I should update this diagram because it actually integrates in with Microsoft Teams now as well, and I'll show you what that looks like. It's pretty cool what they've done from an automation and approval point of view from PowerAutomate to Teams. And I'm a big Teams fan, so I like that. And then ultimately, the data is all going to get stored in a leave request list, and we've got a proper architecture in there that it's secured by design. And then we also have a vacation calendar to say, hey, when it's approved, post it in the vacation calendar so can everybody see who's got what days booked off from a vacation point of view. And then from a time tracking point of view, that's a separate application that has an Azure SQL database behind it. We can use Power BI to mash up what's in the vacation calendar, what's in the leave request list, what's in time tracking, and basically reconcile and analyze and provide some nice analytics of all that. So let's actually go right into demo. Let's take you through what that looks like. So I've got a couple different spots that I'm going to show you this. I had originally planned to do it in our development area. I'm going to do a bit of a hybrid here because dev isn't up to date and functional from that point of view. So I'm actually going to use our live area here. So if I'm an Envision IT or extranet user manager or staff member, this is the home page of our intranet, and I can come into operations here and say, hey, I want to go to employee self-service. Just a separate site collection we set up specifically for that. So things like submitting a new leave request, an expense claim, access into QuickBooks, Workforce, all that stuff is here. It's not super pretty. Shoemakers' children often have no shoes. We have shoes, they just don't look awesome, but they're functional. So it's good enough from that point of view. We have a bit of a dashboard here. actually want to expose more of the Power BI dashboard that I'll show you later as part of that. But let's actually go through the process. Let's say, okay, I want to submit a new leave request. So I've launched out to forms.office.com. And this particular form knows who I am. It says, hey, hi, Peter. You know, the owner will be able to see your name and email address because it is an authenticated form, which is what we want in this scenario here. So we don't have to ask that information. We don't have to ask who your manager is because that's well structured in our Azure Active Directory. I can just say, okay, I want to fill in that I want to book a vacation day. I feel like a day off on Friday. Let's do that March 12th to March 12th. So there's different form field types, you know, a drop-down list, a date picker, a numeric value. Okay, that's one business day. And if I want, I can put some comments in as part of that. So I'll go ahead and submit that. Boom, your response was submitted. So what I should see in a second here is a Teams activity coming through for that. Oh, and I just realized I'm losing my voice already, sorry. And also I can't use my Teams app because I'm in the Teams live meeting. So let me actually come over here and I will just launch a browser version of Teams as well. So I can come in to my apps here. Sorry, the browser's taking a while. There's actually an approvals app. I pinned it on my desktop app, but I'll pin it again here on the browser. And it basically shows me all of the sent and received approval requests. I'm not going to show you the receipt because it's actually live employee data. I don't want to share that out. But this is basically, excuse me, all the ones that I've filled in through here. Let's turn on the notifications. So I can see I did a test one yesterday to try this out last night. And here's the actual requested one that came through. So it shows in my activity feed. It also shows in through here. So I can just go ahead and click on that. And right in Teams, I've got what's called an actionable card here. I love these. This is a big feature of the Power Automate flows. Basically, right in context, either in email, and I'll show you the email in a second, or in Teams, I've got everything I need to make a decision here. You know, Peter's requested one day off for this date range. Here's his comments. Here's a link over to the SharePoint list item, and it's currently pending a response. And I can either approve or reject that. I can cancel the request. I can put some comments in from there. Before I finish that, though, I'm just going to bring up my inbox on my other screen here. And here's that same actionable card showing up in Outlook. And we can see it's got the same information in here, and I've got the same approve, reject. I actually think the visualization on the Teams side is a little cleaner and nicer. It's more modern. And I'm going to show you one more thing. This is actually off my script, but let's show my iPhone for a sec here. And I have a Power Automate app here. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And what I should have in here is under my approvals, there's my vacation request for Peter. And you didn't see it because it had already come up, but a toast came up on my iPhone saying, hey, you've got an approval request through here. I hit the ... get some more details on that, approve, reject, or reassign that. So I've got it in 3 different places, whatever works best for me, I can make use of that. Let's go ahead and do the approval here in Teams. So it's now submitting my response back to the workflow. And actually, if we come back to Outlook, let me close this email. So I didn't do anything to this email, but the email already knows that I've approved it in Teams and it's updated the request over here. So it's smart from that point of view. And the same thing happens on my iPhone. It says, hey, that's already approved. You don't have to do anything from here. This is really nice when you've got multiple approvers, like a first to approve type of scenario. Then if somebody else has approved it and you open it up, you don't even have to think about it because it already tells you, hey, somebody else has approved this, it's done. You don't need to think about it anymore. So it's a great feature. It's something I really like about Power Automate. Now we can do these, I'll talk in a minute about Logic Apps. We can do this style on Logic Apps as well. It's just a little more work to make it happen because Microsoft's done a lot of customization above and beyond Logic Apps in Power Automate to achieve this. So let's have a look under the hood a little bit more. So if I come to forms.office.com, so this is where I see all of my forms have been set up. I didn't actually create that particular form myself. It's under the shared ones. Actually, we can see the survey one. We've got 33 responses in there. We'll have a look at that in a minute as well. So I go to the shared with me. And where did we go? There it is, the request form. So this is the actual designer for the form. So I can click on individual questions. I can change the options that are in there. I can add other ones. I can add another option. You know, I can put sections around it. I can organize it. There's a fair bit of flexibility I can do through here. If I say, hey, I want to add a new, you know, I've got these choices of a choice field that we've seen, a text field like the comments. We can put star ratings on there, date fields. The Likert is the one that we used in our survey through there. There's rankings, net promoter scores. You can even have file uploads as part of the process as well. So it's very sophisticated in terms of what you can do through that. And you can see all your responses in through here. But what I want to focus on is what's happening on the Power Automate side of things. So if I come over to another tab, where do we have it here? Oh, maybe I don't have it open in this view here. Flow.microsoft.com. They changed the name of the product, but it's still called Flow from a URL point of view. and I look at shared with me here, because just like the forms, we can have multiple people work on a flow. And here's our leave request flow. So I've got a run history, and I can see here's the one that just ran, took 3 minutes and 46 seconds because I was going to all the various different approval spots to show you what that looks like before it finished off from there. But I can click on that particular flow and I can see the process that it went through as part of that. So it starts, every flow starts with a trigger. The trigger in this case is that a new response was submitted from a Microsoft form. I'll show you the design view as well, but basically this is saying, hey, a new response was submitted. And it's got to go through and do a bunch of things through there. I'm not going to go too deep on this today. We're going to go deeper on this in the follow-on session the week after next. But basically it goes through here. It figures out some employee data around there, employee IDs, finds the manager. And basically this is the magic one here where it starts and waits for an approval. And that's what sent out those actionable cards that I was showing in the various different scenarios. And then we've got a condition here saying, hey, was it approved, yes or no? It went down the yes path because we can see the green check marks here. So I'm going to update things, create the vacation calendar, and send an email to the person that requested it. Actually, here's that email here saying your vacation request was approved. It's a pretty basic email, but we have full control here. If you want to brand it, you know, richer email, you can certainly do that as part of the flow workflow as well. So if I come over to edit here, I basically see that same view. But I can now go in and actually design that workflow. You know, I've connected this to my Office 365 account, so it knows what forms are available for me to use from that point of view. You know, and it has connections into SharePoint and such, and all that's built out through there. So it's a very visual kind of designer. You know, I can come in here and say I want to add an action, and there's literally hundreds of different connectors with thousands of different actions that you can do. So you can really connect a lot of different systems together and build some pretty powerful workflows through there. Okay, so we talked about the user experience, the approval. We've got the Teams, the email, the iPhone. There's an Android app as well if you're on Android. what happens in the workflow, how the forms is built, and then there's some underlying lists. I'm going to save those technical details to later. Probably cover most of those in the follow-on sessions. As I mentioned, I don't want to get too technical in this session here. Back to my slide deck. Windows together, there we go. So that was scenario 1 that I wanted to cover. Scenario 2 is our Envision IT expense report. This is a more complicated form. You may have lots of itemized expenses, lots of mileage items in here. You may not be able to complete the form in one sitting. You might get through doing a month-end expense report and you can't find a couple of receipts, or you got to figure out something and you've just spent half an hour filling it out. You don't want to throw it away and have to start over. So this one's important to be able to save it as draft, to reopen it later, to resubmit it, and then even as it gets into the approval process, it may get rejected. They may say, you know what, I'm not going to approve that itemized expense because you didn't include the appropriate receipt to go with it. So you need to be able to open it up, add the receipt attachment, resubmit it, and go from there. So this one's obviously more involved. It's not something that we can do in Microsoft Forms. We've actually built this as an HTML form, and I'll talk in a minute about the different technology decisions that we've made in here. But the key points to consider on this one, that idea of being able to modify it after submitting it, that it needs to be able to go through a reject, revise, resubmit kind of process. But ultimately, once it's finance approved, it needs to be locked and read-only from that point of view. The ability to scan and attach receipts is really nice to have. And also the ability to PDF the entire report. These need to be retained for quite some time. It might be 7 years in your organization. Things may have changed. You may not be still using this expense form at that point in time, but you still need to have a record of it. So can we PDF it and archive it as a records from a compliance point of view and apply a retention policy to it from there? And can we do things like integrate into Telpay that we use for electronic payments, or I mentioned SAP for one of our clients from there. So a little more technical, a little more integration going on in this one here. So as I mentioned, we built it as an HTML form. It's running in what's called an Azure App Service. So it's still up in the cloud. It's still managed by Microsoft, but we control the whole code and experience around that. But the base idea is still the same, that somebody fills out that form, whether they're saving it as a draft or submitting it or going through an approval, it's getting posted to a Logic App workflow, which I'll show you in a minute. It's very similar to the concepts behind a Power Automate as well. And just like the leave request, there's a list behind it that manages that, and there's actually a shared data file that has all the employee information that's used by this service as well as the leave request. There's integration in Azure AD, so we can find out profile information about the user and manager information for routing and Exchange to be able to send out those messages. And again, there'd be a line here from a Teams point of view as well. So Azure Logic Apps, it is the platform that sits underneath Power Automate. So now I was showing you that designer and the actions that you could add and building out your workflow visually. It actually looks the same in Logic Apps. It's the same designer. There's a slightly different set of actions. That approval step is a lot simpler in Logic Apps. They haven't built it as richly as they do in Power Automate. But on the flip side, it has really deep Visual Studio integration. So it's good from a professional developer, more of an enterprise application point of view. Now I mentioned app services. We also use that. So the form is actually deployed up as an app service. This is a very scalable scenario. We don't need to manage servers. Everything's managed by Microsoft, and they've got an uptime guarantee on that. So let's have a look at that form. Let's see what that looks like. Come back to my employee self-service home here. So we have our leave request. We also have our submit an expense claim. So if I click on that, I bring up my form. We haven't hidden the fact that it's sitting up in an Azure website. We've left it with that URL. You can put your own vanity URL on there. In fact, our extranet user manager website is actually sitting on that same style of app service, but it has its own domain associated with it. But in any case, we've got the form here. We've kept it very generic. We haven't put any branding or anything like that on it. Works well from that point of view. So, what reporting date am I doing this for? Is it month end for end of February? Who am I? Again, just like the Microsoft Forms, we know who the person is because they're signed into Azure Active Directory before they come to this form. and then let me build out the itemized expenses and mileages from there. And we've got these plus buttons here, so I can just infinitely grow that table and start adding out expenses from there. I can pick a date range in here. We said it was February, so let's go back to the last Friday in February. I went from home to the office. Oops. I know that's not an allowable expense. It needs to be going out to visit a client, which I haven't done in the last year. Everything's work from home these days. But let's go ahead and say that's it's actually only 20 kilometers from my house to the office. So we've got some automatic calculations to figure out the dollars, give me the totals and such from there. I can add in notes from there and I can submit it. So that's a pretty straightforward one. We have a more sophisticated one that we've built for one of our clients. Let me just bring that one up here. Sorry, I just need to pull that onto another screen for a second. I thought I had it open, but I just need the link. There we go. So this is based on the same form. You can see the look and feel is fairly similar between them. We display more employee information in here. This one can actually be submitted by somebody else, so they still get paper-based forms and they want administrators to be able to submit on behalf of staff. So if you have that administrator role, you'd be able to pick an employee and fill out the form on their behalf, and it would record who it was submitted by as well as who it was submitted for. Also, they've got some challenges on the Active Directory side. Not everybody is fully populated out through there. So it defaults to who your manager is, but it does allow you to pick a different manager or approver through there. So you can kind of decide your own approver. Now it still goes through a finance approval step. So if they've picked an inappropriate approver, finance can catch that and flag it from that point of view. We're kind of balancing, it's too onerous. They've got thousands of staff to get all that cleaned up for the expense form. It is something we want to come back to and tidy up from that point of view. And they have the same kilometer and business expenses. They're a little more involved. They have SAP cost elements and cost centers and project numbers that those expenses need to be tracked into, but it's the same sort of rules through there. Actually, we haven't updated our form, but their form we've updated to current CRA rules, which says, hey, your first 5,000 kilometers are 59 cents a kilometer, and then after that it's 53 cents a kilometer. So we actually track the previous expense forms within the calendar year. I think we show that here. Yeah, so we show a year-to-date approved kilometers, so it can figure out when you transition across that 5,000 kilometers if that happens for you. I mean, you have to travel a fair bit, but some of the folks are on the road a lot and do exceed that from that point of view. They've got disclaimers to say, hey, I'm explicitly not putting kilometer expenses in, I'm just putting business expenses, or vice versa. Same comments. The attachments are nice. It's not showing on this view here, but I can actually drag and drop attachments right onto the form itself. And then when I submit the form, they get uploaded as part of the form. So it's a really easy way for them to, take camera pictures or have, electronic receipts for maybe something they've ordered online. Just drag it into the form and it becomes part of the expense submission. And when it's being reviewed by either the approver or finance, they have access to those attachments. They can validate and review that. And it does a full summary by cost centers and elements and such to bring out the entire thing through there. So they can save it as a draft. They can submit it when they're done. Once they do that, they can't make further changes to it unless it gets kicked back to them for revisions. And then there's the approval process that goes up to the supervisor or approver that's been named in here. Once that approver approves it, it goes over to finance from there, and then out from there. If they've saved a draft and for whatever reason they messed up and they didn't actually want to complete that, they can delete a draft. But once it's submitted in, it becomes an official record from that point of view. So if we come back to the technology architecture for a second here, there's a little more involved. We've got SAP in there from an integration point of view. It was actually a hybrid on-premise and in the cloud, so their SharePoint wasn't online, it was on-premise. We had to use Data Gateway to get the workflows that are running in the cloud to talk to on-premise. So I'll get into some more of those technical details in the third session when I dive deep into the expense form scenario. But that gives you a sense of how that hangs together. Okay, so I've taken you through two scenarios here. The first was Microsoft Forms for the leave request, and the second was the expense form done as an HTML form. It's not the only way to do things. I don't have time in the hour to go through all of these, but I do want to mention them and highlight them so you can understand what some of the other options are through here. So we've already talked about forms, but I just want to reiterate, it really is super easy to build a form. You know, it's really straightforward from that point of view. In fact, you know what? Let's take a minute now. I'm just going to pull this back on my other screen for a second, and let's have a look at that form that we put up for this session itself. So I'm just going to make sure I don't share any private information from that point of view. So I'll bring it over to the response views, and we'll just scroll up a little bit here. Oh, it doesn't actually let me share just that piece of it. Let me do a little screen snipping magic. Normally I would just share you the whole forms thing, but I just want to show you sections 3 and 4 from there. Really section 3 being the important one. You know, how are people attending this session using the different technologies that we have here? And nice to see, you know, we've got the majority of the people either actively using or investigating Microsoft Forms. And almost the same on Power Automate, maybe a little less, but certainly still the majority. And actually pretty much evenly split on the PowerApps side of things as well. As we get into the web stack, which was the expense form example, not so much, but still 1/3, 2/3, not a bad split from their point of view, and a little less from a Logic Apps point of view. I mean, the thing to remember with Logic Apps is, as I mentioned, they're very similar to Power Automate. And I'll talk in a minute about the differences between those. So, you know, it does need to be a fill out once form. It's not something you can come back and edit later. You can't do any sort of complex logic like I was showing you on the expense form in the more complex scenario where it was, you know, year-to-date kilometers and kilometer calculations, stuff like that you can't do in Microsoft Forms. But if it fits, it works really well and it's really easy. So I do encourage you to look at it. PowerApps, also pretty popular from what we saw from the survey point of view, is the forms correlation to Power Automate. You know, they're both part of the Power Platform and they're intended to work very closely together. Now, the name Power in Power Apps and Power Automate came from the idea that these were intended for Power users. And honestly, there's been some challenges on that side. Microsoft's backtracked a little. They now call it a citizen developer tool, which means you don't need to be a professional full-time developer working for IT, but you're probably more sophisticated than a typical Power user. And they're trying to shift closer back to the Power user. That's where we saw the Excel formula style design work in PowerApps coming in as part of the Ignite announcements. They're trying to democratize it and make it more accessible to the Power users. It's still a challenge. We've done some proof of concepts with clients to say, hey, can we get your business owners actually building a forms application in PowerApps? It's been a year or two since we last tried that. The result then was, no, this isn't going to work, and we need IT to still manage this. You know, it's getting better, so maybe we're getting closer from that point of view. The challenge we find is when it comes back to IT or to a professional developer, often the tool gets in the way, and the developer gets frustrated and says, hey, if I could just access the whole web stack and build things as I normally did, it'd be actually easier to do this than doing it in PowerApps. So there's always that balance there. You know, and people don't like change. So if you're familiar with sort of traditional development patterns, getting your head around PowerApps can be a challenge from that point of view. The other thing is from a licensing point of view. If you use it strictly to interact with, say, SharePoint lists and you want to customize the list forms, you don't need any additional licensing for that. If you want to build full model-driven apps and standalone apps, licensing can get significant, upwards of $40 per month per user, which is probably for a lot of you more than what you spend on your full Microsoft 365 subscription if you're in a E1 or E3 kind of license model. So, you know, be aware of that. And it's not just the person that's developing the app, it's everybody that consumes that and uses that needs the appropriate licensing for that. The one we focused on for the expense form was what we call HTML forms. So yes, you need a developer. This is not a power user approach. But the beauty is that any web stack developer can do this. They don't need to be super up on the Microsoft way of doing things or the 365 way of doing things. If they're a strong HTML, CSS, styling, and JavaScript developer, and whatever tools they choose to use, open source plugins, Angular, React, frameworks, they can do all that. It doesn't restrict how you architect the form itself. And we've built a design pattern that's quite repeatable, that once we build a form, if that form needs to change and fields needs to change, it's fairly minimal to do those changes. We don't have to change all the pieces all the way through that. The SharePoint framework, in the right scenarios, this makes a lot of sense. In fact, if you were part of the previous webinars that I did earlier this year on Teams provisioning that we do, we have a number of SharePoint framework web parts that are part of that open source solution. So if you're curious about that, I encourage you to look back in our previous events and have a look at that. The advantage with these, yes, they are a little tougher to build than building just a pure web stack HTML form. You do need to be sort of an Office SharePoint framework developer, so it's a more niche type of developer you need for it. But they can be very closely integrated into SharePoint and Teams. We can add that Teams request web part to any site that we want. We can pin it into Teams, and it natively becomes part of that experience. You can do the same thing with a web form, but it's not quite as integrated into the Microsoft 365 platform as part of that. And lastly, there's lots of third-party tools. This is by no means an exhaustive list. If you were to Google, forms and workflow, for example, or even Microsoft 365 forms, you get these and a whole lot more. There's a lot of vendors out there. These are kind of the top ones that I've touched on and have some knowledge of. Nintex's kind of been the longest lasting one. I mean, they've been around for, God, it's got to be 10 plus, maybe 15 years now. They're actually best known as a workflow tool, but they have a forms component to that as well. WebCon is kind of a more recent challenger to Nintex. QuizCom, Intel, Lightning Forms, maybe not the same breadth in the market as Nintex or WebCon, but still significant challengers from that point of view. So these all have licensing associated with them, and there's a variety of licensing models around that. So if you're interested, they do tend to allow you to do more as a power user in terms of building forms. So they tend to be better from a no-code, low-code solution point of view. You got to trade that off with the licensing costs associated with them. So that's on the form side. There's a similar comparison on the workflow side as well. Almost no form exists as an island. Typically there's some process that happens once that form is filled in. Approvals need to happen, routing needs to happen, integration into other systems, SAP, Telpay, what have you, all need to be part of that as well. And we've shown you Power Automate and Logic Apps closely related, and I'll compare and contrast. Those third-party tools that I was just mentioning from a forms point of view, most of those have a workflow engine as part of them as well. So again, you can consider that. Often it's a bundled solution where you get the workflow engine and the forms engine together as one thing through there. But let's dive deeper into Power Automate versus Logic Apps. So as I mentioned already, that there is a common designer. So that design surface that I was showing you is consistent between Power Automate and Logic Apps, and the connectors, the triggers, the actions, with a few exceptions like the richer approvals in Power Automate, are common between. And you can actually import and export workflows between the two. You could start working on it in Power Automate and say, you know what, IT needs to take this over. We need to make it more enterprise ready. Let's move it to Logic Apps, put it into our Azure DevOps. So we've got source control and continuous integration and things like that around it. Or maybe you want to go the other way to say, hey, I started in Logic Apps, but I really want to use that approval features in Power Automate. You can actually export it from Logic App and import it into Power Automate. Obviously, things like that are unique to one platform or another aren't going to translate through that migration process, but everything else will hang together nicely, and you can tweak and adjust it from there. So from a differences point of view, if we look at Power Automate versus Azure Logic Apps. So Power Automate's just like PowerApps, depends on the context of how you use it. If your workflow is focused on things that happen in Microsoft 365, let's say, somebody creates a list item or uploads a document into SharePoint, and you want an email approval or a Teams approval to happen as part of that, that's all in the Microsoft 365 space. It's actually licensing that comes with your Microsoft 365 plan. Doesn't matter what plan you're on, they all include it, that include a number of actions. I think it's 700 workflow runs per user in your organization. So if you have, per month, if you have 1,000 people in your organization, you can run 700,000 instances of your workflows, and it's pooled across all the users. You can have one user run 600,000 of those, and everybody else run, one each or what have you from there. So it's very attractive from that point of view. But as soon as you get into premium triggers and actions, maybe you want to connect in Salesforce, or you want an HTTP post, which is something we use on the HTML workflows, you get into premium licenses, and there you have additional dollars. So it's not as expensive as PowerApps, but it's still not insignificant. $15 per user per month, or $100 per flow per month with a 5-flow minimum. So it'd be $500 USD per month, and then you can have as many people run as many PowerAutomates as you want in your organization. So depending on the size of your org, that flat monthly can make a lot of sense. If you're a smaller org, the user level may make more sense. I think about our team's provisioning. We built that with Logic Apps. That's how we're using it within our organization. We're 18 people. Does it make sense to do 18 times $15, which is $270 per month, just to have a nicer approval on team request when we get less than 5 per month coming through? And it doesn't really make sense. And it doesn't make sense for us to spend $500 a month for that. But if we had 1,000 people in our organization, would it make sense to spend $15,000 per month on Power Automate licenses for the users? Probably not. I mean, even if we had 100 flows in there, I mean, that's 10K a month. It's still a big number, but it's significantly less. And you can mix and match. You could say some of the things we want to do in Power Automate, some of the things we want to do in Azure Logic Apps, because Azure Logic Apps is a purely consumption-based pricing. It's kind of hard to see with all the zeros after the decimal number, but that's 32 millionths of a dollar. So you have to have a lot of actions to add up to even 1 cent of consumption through there. And then your standard and enterprise connectors, even the enterprise connectors are getting into the tenths of a cent per execution. So I mean, if you're running 1,000 workflow instances a month that have one enterprise connection in them, you're talking 100 cents, which is $1 worth of consumption for it. So it's a very small number from that, unless you get into massive consumption runs. And it does have a much richer enterprise deployment and integration story around ARM templates and Azure DevOps. We'll get into that in the technical side. There is a much richer approval process here. This is certainly more end user friendly. So if you want your business users to build stuff, they would probably be find it a little daunting to go into the Azure portal and do things in Logic Apps, and never mind the fact that your system administrators might not want to give them rights into Azure at all as part of that. I mean, you can mitigate that and create a resource group for them and let them play just in that area. But there's still, valid concerns from that point of view that drive things over to the Power Automate side. So, lots of options, lots of things to consider as you go through that process. So that's sort of the technical choices that we had in terms of how we built it. Regardless of what decisions we make there, though, security really needs to be thought about here. Whether it's an anonymous form like I shared out for this webinar session, or it's an employee one that's capturing employee data in there. One of the things we often see when we come into organizations that have done, just SharePoint list forms, and maybe they've built a little Power App or even a Microsoft form, they store that data in SharePoint, but they don't properly secure it. They'll do tricks like, hiding the list so that if you don't know that the list is there, you can't find it, you don't see it. We call that security through obscurity. It's a really bad idea. I mean, it still shows up in search results. It can get discovered through Delve. People find the right URLs or navigate their way down. It's there. You haven't really secured it. You've hidden it, and it's a bad idea. So make sure you properly secure your solution. And we'll get into that in the follow-on 2 technical sessions. Some design patterns that we've built to make that work well. We really want to leverage Azure Active Directory. So if your AD is not in good shape and it needs cleanup, the manager structure is not there, profile is not properly maintained, you got to really focus on that. That's an important part before you start building any sort of self-service. Is how does that work? You got to decide, where does that get mastered? Do we have an HRIS system or a payroll system or an ERP system that manages that for us? build those points of integration. Make sure that you've got a single version of the truth around employee information, and that Active Directory and by extension Azure Active Directory is up to date and current with that. Because we're going to leverage that. We're going to say, okay, staff are going to use their Azure AD credentials to see their items in folders that have been granted permissions to them, and we're going to use that manager structure to allow managers, whether they're one level up direct managers or they're indirect several up the chain, that they have that visibility down, and that folks in finance or HR or payroll have the appropriate access in there as well. How do we do with changes? Is the design and architecture secure itself? There's things I skimmed over in those architecture diagrams. We'll get into more detail in the follow-on sessions about how we did a secure by design through there. So even if you're hacking into individual components in there, the whole thing is secure from that perspective. Think about how we deal with cancellations, what happens with that. And mobile. Mobile is so important these days. How are your staff going to consume these forms? Can they use a personal device? Do you have a BYOD policy? How are they accessing it from outside the firewall? What authentication protocols do you have in place around 365 in general? Are you doing the right things with multi-factor authentication and stuff like that to make sure it's secure? So all things to think about as you're building that out. So, if we look at our org chart, I mentioned we're only 18 people. It's not too big from that point of view. And actually, if I come back to my teams for a minute here, let me actually bring up my chat view. So Logan's on the call. He runs sales and marketing at Envision IT Extranet User Manager. I can come over into the organization tab in Teams, and I can actually see that reporting structure. So Andrew works for him as a marketing specialist. He reports up to me. I can click up to my level. I can go over, say, to Dinesh that leads our development team. I can see all the people underneath him. You should see this in your Microsoft Teams. You should see it in your Outlook people cards. If things are set up properly in Active Directory, you've got the right information in here. If this isn't accurate, it doesn't represent your organization, you need to fix that, because it's so important to having the workflows work properly and having that hang together from that perspective. Your information architecture, again, we'll get more into this in the technical sessions, building out things like employee folders, not just so that we can secure things appropriately, but we can scale things. When we get thousands of employees in there, is SharePoint going to work okay? You need to make some decisions here on how you structure it to make sure that all hangs together. And then just to wrap up, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. We've got all this data and all these SharePoint lists. How do we make use of that? I can see that through SharePoint list views. That's part of the beauty of doing it in SharePoint. If I come back to my employee self-service here, I can see what pending requests staff have submitted that I need to approve. I can see my upcoming request. I can see historical requests all through here. And this is going to be personalized depending on who I am to just show my information through here. And we actually have a manager view of this as well, so you can see your direct reports through there. I honestly don't find this a super friendly way of seeing it. It helps for me as an individual, seeing what my individual requests are. But if I want to look at a more holistic view of that, what I find works really well is to use Power BI. So Power BI is a great tool for building dashboards. So here we have that leave request dashboard where we can actually see, the types of requests, who's made the requests, compare, vacation days versus allocations by staff, see how many vacation days are still pending for the year for the organization. All that information is all there. And it's all very interactive. So if I come over to the actual Power BI dashboard here, I can click on different elements. Maybe I just want to look at vacation days. So I've clicked on that element, and this graph here is now filtered down just to show me vacation days. Or maybe I'm curious about a particular person in there. I can click on that person, see what their taken versus remaining is, how that's playing out, what type of requests those are, and drill into detail from there. So we've got a lot of flexibility around how we do that. We can still have the very granular view, that shows exact details of who's requested what when. We actually use this for reconciliation to say, hey, what's the allocation and carryover of vacation days? How many do they have remaining? How many fits into each of those? And is there particular folks that have pending requests or do we have problem requests that we need to reconcile through there as well? I mentioned we can compare to our time tracking, our vacation calendar, our requests to make sure they all align. The Power BI can do that work for us and just flag what needs to be investigated and corrected from there. So there is licensing associated with the Power BI as well. This gets very confusing the way Microsoft positions it. There's a Power BI free license that you get with your 365. You can almost ignore that. It's only useful for you to create your own dashboards and share them just with yourself. So if you want to share a dashboard with somebody else or publish it to the organization, all of those people need their own Power BI Pro license. You can purchase individual user licenses, or you can get, just like Power Automate, sort of an organizational license. It's pretty pricey. It's upward of $4,000 or $5,000 US per month. So it really only makes sense where you're into big organizations. We would never do it as an 18-person organization. But I love Power BI. We run huge parts of our business on it. It's really key to how we function. So just coming back, got about 5 minutes left here. So some wrap-up points to think about. I threw a lot at you. There's a lot of tool choices. I went deeper on 2 of them, but there was, quite a few more there, both from Microsoft and from third parties. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all. I mean, we're using an HTML form for the expense form because it's a fairly complex form. We're using a Microsoft form for the leave request because it's super simple. Use the appropriate tool. You probably don't want to have 6 different vendors from a third-party point of view in your organization, but Microsoft itself gives you a bunch of choices. You understand the differences and use the right tool for the right thing there. Obviously, you understand the licensing implications of those choices as well. If I do this, what are the implications from a license point of view? Not just from the form point of view, but from the workflow side as well. Don't forget about mobile. Mobile is super important these days. Demographics are changing in the workforce. Everybody's working remotely. There's an expectation that I can consume this not just on my desktop device or my laptop, but on my mobile device. And if you followed my steps at the beginning and scanned the QR code and did the form survey on your mobile device, you'll see that Microsoft's actually done a really nice job of creating a mobile-friendly, responsive form. And I, as a forms designer, didn't need to do anything for that. It just happened. So it's super simple to do that. As tools change, if you're building an HTML form, you got to think about that, but designed right, you build a responsive form that adapts to the device that it's on. PowerApps is a little trickier sometimes from that point of view, but you can have different views and optimize it to different devices. Super important, don't forget about security. Make sure you secure it properly. Don't rely on obscurity, do a proper job. You continue to hear stories of hacks and malware and infiltrations. It's out there. So do that job properly. It's super, super important. You make sure your Azure Active Directory is clean and fully populated. Get that manager structure in there. It's really, really helpful from a workflows point of view. And start simple. Maybe use a Microsoft form. It doesn't have to be a leave request. Think about something in your organization. Maybe it's as simple as I want to do a staff survey. How many people think they're going to come back full-time in the office when everybody's vaccinated and COVID is done, versus how many people want to keep working 100% from home, versus how many people want a middle ground in between. I did that survey for my staff back at the end of the summer in 2020. Answer came back, the median was about 2.5 days in the office. Nobody said 0 days in the office, and nobody said 5 days in the office. It's going to be a different world out there. So, even once we get past this, things are going to change, I think, permanently. Use tools like this to help plan for that and to work with that. I mentioned this is part 1 of 3. So part 2 is the week after next. Actually, both are the week after next, the Tuesday and Thursday lunch hours. The first one goes deep on the leave request side. The second one goes deep on the expense form. Different technology, so we'll geek out on those appropriately from there. Kind of on the geeking out theme, additional series on secure development. I mentioned security is really important. I go deep in the April 20th session on strengthening your development practices with Azure AD. This isn't just about forms and workflow. This is all up. You're building an enterprise application. What should you be doing? And we've built a large finance system recently that's about to go live. A lot of things we learned, a lot of things we implemented as part of that. I want to share that knowledge from that point of view. Software development lifecycle best practices. things like continuous integration, as developers and folks are working on stuff and they're checking them into source repository, how do they get automatically built and deployed out? How do you bring testing into that? Really thinking about the full life cycle of development and what that looks like. And then a couple of other additional webinars as we get out into April and May. One on compliance and document collection. This is coming back more to the Extranet User Manager side. We're actually building a portal product as part of Extranet User Manager, which is all about how do you distribute documents out to people outside your organization, track, use Power BI, things like that, and also how do you collect both feedback to those documents or documents that they need to submit. Lots of different scenarios we're going to explore from a business point of view on that side. And then the last one, a little deeper on the Power BI side. We're using Planner a lot. We've got lots of different Planner boards. How do you mash those up and bring them together, do things like portfolio management across multiple planners and bring them into Power BI dashboards? We've got some cool stuff. We're thinking about open sourcing on that side as well. So lots coming up, more to come as well. Check it out on our events link there. And I am right at the top of the hour. So I haven't had much time to look at the Q&A. I'm not sure if we've got questions in there or whether we should just wrap it at that and bid everybody a great afternoon.
Hey, Peter, there are some good questions in there that I think if you have a minute, it'd be worth addressing.
Sure. So, why don't we let people drop if they need to, but hang in there and let's address some of the questions live in here. They'll be part of the recording if you want to come back to them as part of that as well. So Logan, what's a good top one to pick off the list?
So the top one actually is from Christian. What guidance do you have towards complying with ADA accessibility surrounding forms? So forms that are submitted, how do you make sure that they're complying with WCAG 2.1?
Awesome question. We were actually just talking about this yesterday with a client of ours. We're building an external client portal where they have to fill out lots of applications and such, and we were talking about accessibility. It is a government-funded organization here in Canada. It's super important that they've got the AODA, WCAG compliance from that point of view. It's a tough one to certify because there's not like a testing service you can say, give me a stamp of certification, but there's a ton of best practices you should be doing as part of that. Things like contrast, ability to support screen sizing and screen readers and things like that. Probably a good topic to maybe add as a follow-on webinar topic to say, hey, if I build a form in Microsoft Forms, is it automatically accessible? You have very little control over the user experience in that. My sense is it is, but it'd be good. We've actually just recently partnered with another design firm that has in-house accessibility UX consultants that have focused on this, and we're going to get them involved in that other project. So I'd love to get more on that side. As you get into custom built forms like the expense form that I was showing you, there's some best practices that we follow around how we lay the fields out, what sort of user experience we use as part of that. Things like type ahead that make screen readers work much better for visually impaired, and screen readers from that point of view. Just the ability to think about the minimum number of steps and minimum number of clicks is important from that perspective. Making sure that it scales properly from a browser sizing point of view are all things that we need to think about as we're building the forms out. So lots of topics there. Christian, thanks for asking the question. I know I did go that deep in it, but definitely something maybe we should dive deeper into.
Sure.
Logan,
another. I'm going to say one more quick one, Peter. Have you looked at building the custom HTML forms as SPFX web parts?
So that's a great question, and I didn't touch on it, but let me come over to our existing SharePoint Framework web part. So if I was to come to our landing site that has that on it, so this is the web part that we use to request a new team or a new SharePoint site. We pick a division, we say, hey, we're setting up a new client site, and it asks me a bunch of questions. This is a SharePoint Framework web part, but it's kind of cool how we built it. There's a content type behind it, and we can add new fields to that content type. We don't even need to change the web part, it just adds new fields, and it understands how to put a people picker or a date picker or a drop down or a lookup field on there. So it actually becomes a really powerful tool for doing something like that. An expense form isn't something that you could build with a generic approach like that because it's got a lot of interdependency, but yes, we could have built the expense form that way. The main decision I make, should I build it as HTML form or a SharePoint framework web part is, am I going to use this in more than one place on my website? If the answer is no, like you don't need 3 different spots in your internet where you can pull up an expense form, it doesn't make sense. So it's actually easier to build as an HTML form. So I would say make that choice. But this one, we actually use it in a lot of places. We have it in Teams, we have it in different hub sites in our internet, and it actually makes a lot of sense. When I'm in my client's hub site, it doesn't ask me the division, it just asks me the name of the client that I want to set up because I'm already in the client spot. It's the same SharePoint framework web part, but it's configurable and you can drop it in multiple places. So if it's something you're going to reuse in a bunch of places, SPFX web part makes a lot of sense. If it's something that you're going to build once and it's got a high degree of customization to it, HTML forms make a lot more sense there. Kristen, you got a bunch of great questions in here. The security and compliance from citizen developers. Yes, I totally agree that it's often or probably typically overlooked by citizen developers. And how do you validate that sensitive data is not exposed or used? I mean, part of it is some of the new announcements for Ignite that they're bringing the data loss prevention into PowerApps. So if your citizen developer is building something there, you can start to layer some protection on as part of that. That really only addresses part of it. It doesn't address the security part of it. I mean, you have to have a secure by design. So I think it's important to either educate the citizen developers before they start, have some sort of review process in there to say, hey, have you done things right? Are you doing things like security through obscurity? Do you realize why that's a really bad idea? And here's a way that's not too tough for you to have a different design pattern to adopt that. So it's really important to get that education out there. Whoever's going to be building it, whether it's part of the business or whether it's part of IT, they need to understand that secure by design. And it doesn't have to be a super technical explanation for the citizen developer, but they need to be aware of it and thinking about it. One more from Christian was the reopen a form. I mean, that is the expense example where we need to be able to submit it and reopen it and change it. And that's where Microsoft Forms doesn't make sense because it doesn't let you do that. But something like a custom HTML form or a PowerApps or a SharePoint framework web part can definitely be built to support that kind of model. Logan, any I've missed there that premium connectors on the leave request? There's an HTTP request to SharePoint. Oh, good catch. Somebody's got a smart eye there. So this was a frustrating point with Microsoft, that they made all the HTTP connectors premium so that you couldn't use that to kind of bypass going out to call to Salesforce or do something premium as part of that. But then they put a little backdoor in there because so many of us yelled at them about that. And they said, okay, they've actually got an HTTP connector specific to SharePoint. Because the problem is there's some things they haven't built connectors for SharePoint to do. There's certain actions that you're not able to do through the native Power Automate connectors. And they said that connector that does an HTTP post to SharePoint, because we didn't build a connector for you, it should still be a standard connector. So it actually isn't a premium one through there. We were really strict when we built that leave request process. We needed that Power Automate to be non-premium licensing for that. That was the design pattern we were going for that. We said, we want to build a solution that doesn't leverage any of the premium licensing. Can we get this done? Can it do everything that we need to do? And I think we succeeded. And yes, we will be publishing the recording at the end. So look, we had 50 people hang in there. So much appreciated everybody for hanging in for the questions. Logan, I think I covered them all there, did I not?
Yes, I think you're all set.
Awesome. Well, wish everybody a great rest of your day. And if you haven't already registered and you're interested, hop on and sign up for sessions 2 and 3 from here. Love to see you and continue the conversation. Thanks, everybody.